Welcome back to the deep dive. This is the place where we really don't just summarize the research. We sift through everything, neuroscience journals, computational models, even philosophy, to bring the core insights directly to you. And today, we're wrestling with a question that is, it's fundamental to being human, the concept of the self.
Yeah.
Is the you that you feel every day a fixed, unified thing? Or is it, as some pretty cutting-edge science is suggesting, just a story, a manufactured narrative, or maybe even an illusion? Our mission here is to synthesize findings from these incredibly diverse fields. We're talking long-term meditators on one hand and biologically inspired AI on the other, to really understand the mechanics of identity. And crucially, we want to figure out why any of this matters for your daily life.
What's so interesting here is that we're defining the enemy right from the start. And the enemy really is self-rigidity. We're looking at this excessive fixation on a fixed self-narrative. And the psychological inflexibility that comes from that, which, according to our sources, is tied to some pretty significant psychological costs.
Right, so things like persistent depression or anxiety or just that constant rumination.
Exactly. Those are often fueled by an inability to step outside of a fixed and usually negative narrative about who you are. So the central question for you, the listener, isn't really about whether you have a self. It's more about how you can cultivate a more flexible, a more dynamic, and an interdependent perspective of what you are.
Yeah.
And by doing that, lessening the grip of that rigid, painful inner story.
Exactly. We're moving this whole conversation out of the philosophy department and into actionable neurology and computation. If the self is mutable, if it's reprogrammable and dynamic, then how do we actually use that knowledge to become a healthier, more adaptable version of ourselves? Let's start with the architecture. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's unpack this. We all feel like we have a central operating system, right? A single me that's, running the show. But the biological reality seems to be far more decentralized. What does the brain actually use to construct this continuous feeling of identity, this constant sense of self?
Well, the first thing we really have to grapple with is that the sense of self, biologically, is less like a central control tower and much more like a widely distributed, highly synchronized system. If you were to look inside the brain of someone retrieving self-knowledge or thinking about their past or projecting their future, all these self-referential tasks, you'd find activity in a whole constellation of anatomical structures.
Okay, so can you walk us through some of the key players in that constellation?
Certainly. The critical structures include the medial prefrontal cortex, the MPFC. It's often associated with theory of mind and self-assessment, which is just absolutely crucial. You also see the medial posterior parietal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the PCC, and the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC. They all chime in.
And the insular cortex, right, that's involved.
Oh,
too.
deeply involved. The insular cortex often links our internal body states, those visceral feelings, to that sense of self-reference.
Wow, so that's a large and really dispersed set of areas just to generate the feeling of me. It definitely shatters that old intuitive idea that the self is just one tiny spot behind the eyes, a Cartesian ego.
It does. And the sources really emphasize this. Because of this wide distribution, the sense of self has to be understood as a system-level phenomenon. It's not a structure. It's a pattern of activity. And this pattern is contained in what neuroscientists call circuit impulse patterns, or CIPs.
Wait, circuit impulse patterns, should we simplify that a bit? Or are we talking about like the brain's greatest hits playlist, or is it more like a super complex spreadsheet that's always recalculating?
It's much closer to the spreadsheet. But maybe think of it this way. It's not the individual notes being played by the orchestra. It's the rhythm and the timing of the entire orchestra working together. The CIPs are the continuous flow, the coherence, the shifts in activity timing among all these widely distributed circuits. It's this coordinated dynamic synchronization across the MPFC, the PCC, and all the others that generates and sustains the conscious sense of self. It's a constantly running, self-reinforcing pattern, not a fixed physical place.
And neuroscientists, they break this pattern of self-awareness into two main modalities, right? To help us distinguish between just existing and actually having a life story.
Precisely. We distinguish the minimal self, which is pre-reflexive, transient. It's that moment-to-moment feeling of being alive, sensing your body, being an agent in space. And we distinguish that from the narrative self. The narrative self is the one that's extended in time. It's the autobiography. It relies heavily on memory, on language, and imagination. This is the self we access when we sit down and do some deep introspection or self-referential processing, thinking about who we were 5 years ago or who we plan to be next year.
And this is where we hit the real epicenter of so much psychological distress, because that narrative self is just inextricably linked to the default mode network, the DMN, which is famous or maybe infamous for keeping us stuck inside our own heads.
The DMN is deeply, deeply coupled with that narrative self, and this coupling is a real double-edged sword. When the DMN is overly active or, excessively rigid, it is strongly associated with rumination, with relentless self-evaluation, and the development or maintenance of conditions like depression and social anxiety.
So when your brain is just resting, it defaults to anxiously rerunning and sort of hardening the story of me.
That's a great way to put it, that churning is often the DMN at work. Conversely, research from contemplative neuroscience, and this is reviewed in books like Altered Traits, it shows that effective long-term meditation practice can induce a decrease in DMN activity. And this decrease is linked experientially to less rumination and critically to greater psychological flexibility.
That's so interesting because I've heard that in early meditation, brain circuits can sometimes temporarily encourage DMN activity.
They can, yes, as the person is first learning to observe their thoughts. But with advanced long-term practice, the network itself calms down.
So the goal isn't to get rid of self-reflection, but to shift the quality of it from that anxious rumination with high DMN activity to a calm, observational meta-awareness with low DMN activity.
That is the entire therapeutic target.
Yeah.
And we have to remember, the self isn't just a brain process floating in a vacuum. The physical experience is mandatory.
Right. We always talk about the mind-body connection, but here, the body is part of the self-construct.
Absolutely. The sense of embodiment, our core understanding of our physical body, our sense of agency, that I am the one initiating this movement, and our location in space. All of that is fundamental for the full conception of self. Sensory input, bodily experiences, motor feedback, they all profoundly impact our overall perception, which challenges any leftover idea that the mind is innate and somehow separate from the physical vehicle.
And the building blocks of this narrative, the history we carry, that's our memories.
And those memories are essential, though, I should say, often unreliable. The way we feel about ourselves is profoundly shaped by our autobiographical memories. Our brain structures, specifically the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex again, they're involved in retrieving these specific life events. The self is constantly synthesizing these recollections, smoothing out the rough edges, making them fit into a continuous, coherent story, which gives us that feeling of persistence over time.
And the really compelling biological evidence that the self is an activity, not a thing, it comes from when that activity breaks down. So what do these impaired views of self tell us about the normal process?
Oh, they reveal the fragility of the entire construct. Let's look at two key areas, psychological conditions and physical injury. So regarding psychology, think about conditions like schizophrenia and other psychoses. Research suggests that core disturbances of the self, that feeling that one's own identity is dissolving or being externally controlled, that might actually underlie the acute symptoms of psychosis. When researchers ask individuals who are prone to these conditions to describe their own self-traits, they show measurably altered activation patterns compared to healthy controls.
How does that altered pattern show up? What does it look like?
Well, they show increased activation in regions like the left insula, which is involved in interoception, alongside the right dorsomedial prefrontal cortex and left ventromedial prefrontal cortex. This suggests that the very mechanism the brain uses to generate positive self-regard is metabolically and anatomically distinct and, frankly, overworked in vulnerable populations. The fundamental process of identifying me is already under a lot of strain.
That is a massive difference. The actual neural pattern used to describe the self is distinct.
And if we look at physical fragmentation, the case of split-brain patients is the classic illustration. When the corpus callosum, which is the main bridge connecting the two hemispheres, is severed, the two halves of the brain can function largely on their own. If you ask the right hemisphere to perform an action, the left hemisphere, which has the language center and often the main narrative self, it will immediately fabricate a logical, coherent reason for that action, even if it had no knowledge of the command whatsoever.
Wow. So the narrator self in the left brain sees the action that was started by the right, and instead of saying, I have no idea why I did that, it just instantly creates a plausible, even if it's a false story, to maintain that illusion of a single self.
Exactly. It shows that the self is not a singular entity. It's an emergent interpreter, and it's desperate to maintain a continuous narrative.
And then there's the classic, stark reminder, traumatic brain injury, or TBI, the case of Phineas Gage.
Phineas Gage is still the most famous example. Before his accident, he was described as a diligent, mild-mannered foreman. After a tamping iron went through his skull, critically damaging his prefrontal cortex, a key region for regulating personality and decision-making. He became volatile, unreliable, prone to these extreme emotional swings. His memory was fine, his motor function was fine, but his identity was fundamentally altered because the physical structure underlying that self-construct had been damaged.
He looked the same, but his self was gone.
It's the ultimate evidence that personality and self-perception are fragile and tied to specific brain structures. We also see this in stroke patients. Some patients report a far more negative self-perception after a stroke, while others, in cases like anosognosia, might even deny their own paralysis because their internal self-narrative just hasn't updated to reflect the biological reality. The self is tenacious, but it's also highly fragile. So if we connect all these biological clues to the bigger picture, the message is pretty clear. The rigidity of the self-concept is often what creates psychological suffering. We've seen the brain isn't a singular I, but a collection of synchronized patterns. This raises the critical philosophical and biological question. Is the unified staple self we perceive actually an accurate reflection of reality? And the convergence of modern science strongly suggests it is not.
The idea that the self is an illusion is, I mean, it's certainly provocative and maybe a little scary for some listeners. What's the evidence that suggests this continuous unified self is just a constructed narrative?
The argument really rests on three pillars. First, as we've already established, there is no single physical location in the brain for the self. It's an emergent property, like wetness emerging from water molecules. If you dissect a circuit, you find neurons, not the self.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, the sources strongly argue that the self is a constructed narrative based on selective and altered recollections. The memory retrieval process is inherently constructive and, frankly, often flawed. We rewrite our personal history slightly every single time we recall it, smoothing out contradictions and emphasizing traits that fit our current identity goals. This ongoing process generates the feeling of a continuous, reliable self, but the continuity is a function of the story, not necessarily the underlying biological reality.
So we are constantly editing our own autobiography just to maintain this illusion of stability.
Precisely. And the third pillar is the experimental evidence that shows just how easily the brain can fabricate or dissolve the sense of self and body ownership.
This is where the theatrical elements come in, the illusions that prove identity is mutable. Let's talk about the rubber hand illusion.
It's the simplest and probably the most profound demonstration of the mind's malleability. So a participant hides their real hand, and a fake rubber hand is placed in front of them. The experimenter strokes both the real hidden hand and the visible rubber hand at the same time. And within minutes, the brain's multisensory integration system gets tricked. Participants start to report feeling the sensation coming from the rubber hand. They feel a sense of ownership over this fake limb.
The brain literally adopts an artificial object as part of the self. That shows incredible, rapid flexibility.
And just as telling is phantom limb syndrome. In these cases, people who've had a limb amputated still feel proprioception, pain, even the location for the missing limb. This proves that the brain's internal representation of the self and the body schema, the neurological map, it persists even after the physical body part is gone. The map is often more real to the self than the physical territory.
And we see this kind of fragmentation in clinical settings, too.
Yes. Conditions like dissociative identity disorder, or D, which used to be called multiple personality disorder, they are extreme examples of this fragmentation. They reveal that identity is not a fixed core, but can be functionally partitioned into distinct, highly complex identities or alters, each operating with unique memories, behaviors, and even neural signatures. This is the brain's ultimate demonstration that the boundaries of the self are adaptive, fragile, and definitely not monolithic.
So all of this evidence points away from the self as a rigid, solid thing and more toward it being a verb and ongoing activity. How do we synthesize that?
This is all encapsulated in what's known as the pattern theory of self. This theory posits that the self is not a fixed, singular structure, but rather a dynamic and emergent process. It's continuously being shaped by cognitive mechanisms, by bodily states like hunger or fatigue, and by contextual environments, who you are when you're alone versus who you are at work. And the crucial implication here is clinical. Psychological challenges, like intense anxiety or a paralyzing fear of failure, they stem from self-rigidity, from the stubborn, automatic fixation on these constructed narratives rather than the absence of a healthy self altogether. The goal is flexibility.
This sounds strikingly similar to some very old ideas from contemplative traditions. Is this where philosophy and neuroscience finally lock arms?
They absolutely do. The pattern theory of self aligns profoundly with the Buddhist concept of anatta, or non-self. And it's important to clarify, anatta does not mean you don't exist. It's a common misinterpretation. It means that no part of your identity is fixed, eternal, or substantial.
So it's not nothingness, but rather no-thingness, a collection of interdependent parts.
Exactly. Anatta emphasizes the impermanent, dynamic, and interdependent nature of identity. It directly challenges the Western tradition's focus on a fixed, substantial, and independent soul or core self. The self is an event, not an object.
And meditation provides the experiential first-person proof of this dynamic nature. So what happens when practitioners sit and look closely at their own mind?
They often discover that thoughts and emotions arise spontaneously, without a centralized, volitional controlling thinker. Thoughts just appear and then they dissipate. This direct experiential observation can lead to deep states of ego dissolution, a transient loss of the subjective feeling of being an independent agent or a centralized controller.
So the feeling of being the captain of the ship temporarily disappears. But what's fascinating is that actions still happen.
That's the key observation. Even states of profound ego dissolution, decisions, motor commands, and intentions still arise. And this shows that the capacity for sophisticated agency is tied to underlying brain activity, those CIPs we talked about, not to the subjective feeling of being a fixed, solid self. The mind can, in effect, run itself very competently without the conscious, narrating self needing to be present. It demonstrates that the self is an interpreter and a predictor, not necessarily the prime mover.
Okay, here's where we cross into the realm of artificial intelligence and where it gets really interesting. If the self is this emergent dynamic process that's necessary for controlling a body in the world, can we model its emergence in silicon? A cutting-edge model called MARTI-5 suggests that defining the self is not just a philosophical concept. It's a necessary computational strategy for accurate prediction and for survival.
MARTI-5 is a groundbreaking system. It doesn't just mimic intelligent behavior, it attempts to mimic the biological process of constructing an identity. It's a biologically inspired mathematical model designed to rigorously distinguish the self from the environment and then use that separation to inform purposeful, goal-directed action. And it's important to note, it uses a hybrid digital symbolic multi-agent architecture. It specifically rejects the whole black box nature of standard deep neural networks in favor of something more structurally comparable to the brain.
So tell us more about the architecture. What biological features is MARTI-5 actually modeling?
The architecture models the neocortex as an ensemble of microagents. You can think of them as tiny, independent processing units, roughly analogous to cortical columns in the human brain. This massive ensemble is governed by a functional equivalent of the basal ganglia, specifically the striatum, which in biology is a major player in filtering and selecting actions. And crucially, MARTI-5 explicitly incorporates the classic neuroscientific distinction between the two major streams of processing, the ventral what pathway and the dorsal where pathway.
That distinction, what versus where, is so fundamental to how we process the world.
It is. But the core challenge for MARTI-5 is that it starts with zero prior knowledge. It doesn't know its own shape, its boundaries, or its capabilities. So how does this purely computational agent figure out what it is?
That's the billion-dollar question. How do you program a sense of self from scratch?
The model's foundational assumption is, I think, brilliant in its simplicity. The agent's own body is the most predictable and controllable part of the observable world. I mean, think about you, the listener. You can decide right now to move your toe. You can predict with near certainty that your toe will move. You cannot decide, however, that the sun will stop shining or that the traffic will suddenly dissolve.
Right.
So MARTI-5 exploits this. It searches its vast input data, which in test cases like Atari games is the entire RAM state of the screen, to find those components, those features, whose next state is strongly influenced by the agent's previous action.
So it's not looking for a picture of itself, but for a pattern of reliable cause and effect where it is the cause.
Precisely. This controllability is quantified using a powerful statistical tool, pointwise mutual information, or PMI.
Okay, let's slow down on PMI. That sounds very technical. How can we explain PMI in simple terms for someone who hasn't seen a statistics textbook in a decade?
For sure. PMI measures how much knowing event A tells you about event B. In MARTI-5's case, it measures how much knowing the previous action, say, the agent pushed left, increases the predictability of the next state of a specific feature, like the position of object X. If the previous action gives you a high informational gain about the next position, that feature is highly controlled by the agent.
Okay, let's use a concrete example, like the game Pong.
Perfect. In Pong, the agent controls a paddle. When the agent presses up, the position of its paddle changes predictably. The PMI calculation for the paddle's position will be high It's strongly influenced by the agent's action. So that feature gets confirmed as part of the self-representation. It's essentially a confirmed where column.
And the opponent's paddle, or the ball.
Exactly. If the agent pushes up, the opponent's paddle position is unaffected. The PMI for the opponent's paddle is low. The ball's trajectory is also low because it's influenced by physics and impacts, not just the agent's last move. So the agent rejects those features as belonging to the controllable self.
That is genuinely elegant. The self is computationally defined by its controllable degrees of freedom in the environment.
That's it. If the average PMI for a feature exceeds a predefined threshold, in the sources, it was PMI greater than 1 bit. That feature is statistically confirmed as part of the self-representation. Most candidate features are eventually rejected and pruned, refining a self-model into a minimal, essential set of control vectors.
So once the agent knows what it is, how does it use this hard-won self-knowledge to actually play the game and achieve goals? This brings us to the split function, right?
It does. The confirmed self-representation becomes the key to efficiency. The split function divides the cognitive labor into the what and the where. So, the what columns, which are like the ventral stream, they're responsible for global strategy. They identify the most desirable next global state, the optimal situation the agent should reach, driven by maximizing expected future reward. Think of this as setting the GPS destination. I want to be at the coordinate where the ball is about to hit my paddle.
The ultimate goal, the desired outcome.
Yes. Meanwhile, the where columns, which are like the dorsal stream, use that confirmed self-representation to focus on local tactics. They determine which action, move left, move right, or do nothing, is most likely to move the agent's own state from its current location, A, to the target location, B, that corresponds to that desired global state. It's the steering wheel and the gas pedal.
And the striatum, the equivalent of the basal ganglia, it orchestrates the whole process.
It acts as the final decision maker. It orchestrates action selection via majority voting among the confirmed where parsers. This system is far more efficient than previous models that just treated the self and the environment as one big, undifferentiated observation vector.
And did modeling the self-boundary actually translate into better performance for the AI?
Substantially better. Marty 5 successfully learned competent, efficient policies in complex environments like Pong and Breakout. Critically, it substantially outperformed its immediate predecessor, Marty 4, which lacked this explicit self-separation mechanism. On Breakout, Marty 5 scored an average of 50 points, which far surpassed the baseline of 5.2 and even exceeded average human performance of 31.
That dramatic performance increase just from the simple act of defining a boundary. That's the huge takeaway for biology. It supports the idea that the neural specialization of the ventral and dorsal streams in our own brains may have an evolutionary origin rooted in this very necessity.
It leads to the formulation of what the sources call self-awareness principle 1. The ability to distinguish the self from the world is a necessary but not sufficient condition for self-awareness. The model suggests that the fundamental evolutionary purpose of the ventral dorsal stream specialization is this continuous predictive delineation of self versus non-self. And why? To enable more accurate forecasting and adaptive control. If you know exactly what you can control, you can filter out all the noisy, uncontrollable data and only focus your energy on goal-directed action. The computational construction of the self is thus functionally equivalent to localizing the agent's controllable degrees of freedom within the world.
Okay, so we've established that the self is dynamic, not fixed, and that self-rigidity causes suffering. We've even seen how a machine can computationally define its own boundaries just for efficiency. Now, what practical experiential tools do we have to increase this crucial self-flexibility? This is where the ancient tools of deconstructive meditations, or DMs, enter the modern conversation, offering an experiential path to dismantle those rigid, painful patterns.
DMs are conceptually distinct from the mindfulness practices that many listeners might be familiar with, like, basic focus breathing. They differ from attentional practices, which aim to stabilize focus, and constructive practices, which aim to develop positive states like kindness. DMs focus instead on dismantling rigid cognitive patterns by directly exploring the fundamental nature of perception, cognition, and emotion itself.
So if mindfulness is observing the thoughts, DMs are observing the nature of the thoughts, like who they belong to, whether they're permanent, that sort of thing.
Exactly. The central mechanism they use is deep self-inquiry. And this is not intellectual philosophy. It's an experiential process. It involves directly observing the patterns of the self, questioning the solidity of identity, and developing new, more flexible ways to relate to your internal experience. The sources point to classic examples. Vipassana, often translated as insight meditation, is a DM because it trains the observation of impermanence, or anicca, in all sensations, thoughts, and feelings. If you see everything changing moment to moment, the idea of a fixed self starts to crumble. Then you have non-dual practices like Dzogchen and Mahamudra, which facilitate a transformation toward a more fluid, unified experience where the subjective I and the objective world start to blur.
Let's talk about the neurocognitive mechanisms. This is the bridge between the practice and the brain structures we named in part one. What measurable changes happen when practitioners engage in deep self-inquiry?
We see therapeutic changes mediated by three critical processes, and they all modulate those self-referential circuits we talked about. First, there is meta-awareness. This is the capacity to become aware of your own cognitive and emotional processes as they are happening. It promotes self-regulation and, crucially, it reduces cognitive fusion, that feeling that I am this thought. Research shows this mechanism is associated with decreased activity in the posterior cingulate cortex, the PCC, a central hub in the default mode network.
That's the difference between being lost in the movie and realizing you were just watching a movie.
Precisely. The second mechanism is cognitive diffusion, or decentering. This is the ability to intentionally distance yourself from painful internal experiences, seeing thoughts and emotions as transient, non-real events of the mind rather than absolute reflections of reality. This detachment mechanism is mediated by reduced activity in the PCC and the temporoparietal junction, or TPJ.
The TPJ is fascinating. Doesn't that region play a role in spatial awareness and perspective taking?
It does, and that's probably why diffusion works so well. When you reduce activity in the TPJ, it affects your ability to locate you in space and time. It makes it easier to see your thoughts as events that are separate from your core identity. A study of advanced meditators even found that a reduction in beta activity in the PCC and TPJ is associated with reduced identification with mental content and therefore greater self-flexibility.
And finally, that brings us to the modulation of the embodied self. How does just sitting still and observing your mind actually change how you feel about your physical body?
Advanced DMs can lead to the dissolution of the embodied self. A study by Trautwein and his colleagues found this experience was associated with measurable decreased beta activity in the medial posterior cortex. This decreased beta activity is linked to a lower fixation on self-referentiality and a transformation in how the brain integrates multisensory information about the body. These practitioners can achieve what are called self-boundary dissolution states, transient, non-pathological alterations in agency, body ownership, and self-location. And these states correlate directly with greater self-flexibility and require a non-reactive, surrendered attitude during the meditation itself. It is a trainable skill to loosen the brain's grip on that fixed body map.
This sounds incredibly pertinent, but does it actually translate to clinical results beyond just self-reports?
Yes. We have growing clinical support. Vipassana practice, for instance, has been associated with better response inhibition and lower emotional reactivity. That suggests more efficient, less reactive cognitive control. But perhaps the most powerful finding comes from a meta-analysis of 47 studies on various meditation programs. This analysis found that meditation and clinical medicine were equally effective in treating core conditions like depression, anxiety, and pain. And the key difference, the meditation outcomes were achieved without medication's negative side effects. This shows that self-deconstructive techniques can function as true, non-pharmacological interventions.
And now we're seeing integrated, evidence-based clinical models emerging, ones that specifically target this concept of the dynamic self.
We are. For example, the Insight-Based Mindfulness Program is a Vipassana-based intervention focusing specifically on the principles of impermanence, anicca, and non-self, anatta. It has demonstrated positive effects on emotional discomfort and cognitive flexibility by directly attacking the idea of permanence and suffering.
This research also gives us new insights into deep-seated psychological mechanisms like the fear of death.
Precisely. Neurophenomenological research, which systematically combines detailed first-person reports with neuroscientific data, confirms that dissolving the sense of self involves actual neural changes in agency and bodily perception. Experienced meditators, because of their repeated exposure to the dissolution of their fixed identity, have even shown neurophysiological markers of death acceptance. This suggests that death denial is not a fixed, immutable psychological mechanism, but a trainable pattern that can be softened through DM practices, leading to greater well-being. By letting go of the small I now, the big I seems less frightening later. Now, while the potential of DMs for alleviating identity-based suffering is immense, I mean, it addresses the root cause of self-rigidity, the field is still considered incipient. It's relatively new to mainstream science. So we have to discuss the methodological challenges and, crucially, how to safely integrate these potent practices into clinical settings.
Right. One of the primary concerns, understandably, is safety. If you are intentionally deconstructing the very foundation of identity, you need a powerful mechanism to prevent fragmentation or, disorientation.
Absolutely. The intentional dissolution of self-boundaries can induce transient states of depersonalization, derealization, or existential emptiness. And those feelings can be terrifying, particularly in individuals without adequate training, or in those with pre-existing conditions like trauma or severe anxiety. The consensus among researchers and clinicians is that it's the functional counterbalance. Constructive practices like loving kindness or compassion meditation are essential because they actively facilitate altruistic behaviors. They also induce structural changes in socioaffective regulation areas, specifically the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and the anterior insula. So when you decrease the self-centered mode of functioning through compassion, you increase your disposition toward others and ground yourself in universal values. This strengthens the psychological foundation that's required for the destabilizing work of deconstruction. You need a purpose or value system to anchor to when the self-narrative temporarily breaks down, and compassion provides that functional and ethical direction.
So you build a positive, outward-focused self before you attempt to dismantle the rigid, inward-focused self. And this blending of practices is already seen in several emerging therapeutic frameworks.
It is. A major framework is acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, which already focuses heavily on psychological flexibility, decentering, and connecting with core values. However, ACT doesn't typically provide deep phenomenological tools to directly address how identity is constructed and rigidified.
So DMs could update ACT by giving practitioners a more direct, experiential tool to investigate the mechanics of that self-narrative.
Precisely. They add a deeper experiential layer of intervention than traditional cognitive restructuring. We also see specific adapted practices emerging directly from contemplative traditions, like feeding your demons. This is adapted from Tibetan Buddhism and is a comprehensive practice that deliberately combines attention, constructive visualization like dialoguing with an emotional experience, personifying a feared demon, and the deconstructive exploration of impermanence. And preliminary research has shown significant improvements in self-compassion and psychological well-being using this specific framework. It provides a highly structured way to transform deeply maladaptive emotional and cognitive patterns.
Okay, so moving from the clinical models to the research side, what are the current methodological challenges that are hindering the standardization and wider adoption of DMs?
Well, the field suffers from several significant gaps. First and foremost, we just lack clear operational definitions and standardized protocols for DMs. Unlike, say, mindfulness-based stress reduction, MESR, or MBCT, which have these standardized curricula, DMs methods like a specific Vipassana lineage or a Mahamudra instruction, they vary widely, making it extremely difficult to conduct replicable studies across different labs.
So we need to standardize the instruction before we can reliably test the results.
Exactly. And second, there's a scarcity of adequate neurophenomenological measures. We need tools that go beyond simple self-report questionnaires of anxiety or depression. Future work needs multidimensional tools that combine neurophysiological measures like fMRI or EEG tracking of those circuit impulse patterns with detailed first-person phenomenological analysis to capture the nuanced changes in self-perception and flexibility. We need to measure not just if people feel better, but how their internal experience of self is being restructured.
So what are the most promising directions for future research to close these gaps?
Rigorous randomized controlled trials, RCTs, are essential. We need to compare DMs to established, empirically supported therapies like MBCT or ACT with long-term follow-up to ensure the durability of the effects. We also require dedicated studies on combining DMs and constructive practices to really validate that safety net hypothesis.
But the most innovative and rapidly advancing direction seems to involve technology specifically, using technology to actively induce and study these states safely.
We're talking about the use of virtual reality, or VR. VR offers a safe, controlled laboratory setting to induce self-boundary dissolution states without the intense physiological commitment of long-term monastic practice. It allows researchers to modulate the sensory information that feeds the minimal self. A great example is the Clearlight VR program, which was designed for people facing life-threatening illnesses. It uses abstract visual representations to promote the dissolution of conventional self-perceptions, encouraging a sense of profound interpersonal connectedness instead. Initial observational studies showed significant reductions in anxiety and depression and improved connection with others in participants. VR offers a way to democratize access to these profound self-transformative experiences by controlling the environmental variables. We've covered a vast amount of ground today, bridging ancient contemplative wisdom with, cutting-edge computational modeling. And whether you choose to call the self an illusion, a constructed narrative, or an emergent predictive process, the core scientific takeaway is clear. The self is profoundly dynamic, highly trainable, and deeply intertwined with the brain's predictive and control machinery. As the Marty 5 model showed, even a machine needs to delineate the controllable self from the world for adaptive efficiency. The future of mental health and therapeutic intervention may very well depend on learning how to intentionally deconstruct and loosen the grip of the rigid I we mistakenly carry around.
And the initial question wasn't just what the self is, but what it means for you, the learner, who is now aware that you carry this dynamic, flexible, and mutable structure around with you every single day. The source material suggests a profound reframe. Our current westernized concept of a stable self-awareness might just be the first necessary evolutionary step towards a more complex, less ego-driven, and highly adaptable existence. If the self is, at its core, a constantly synthesized story, a collection of those circuit impulse patterns that the brain runs to predict its environment, then the capacity for introspection, for reviewing and modifying those deep-seated CIPs, is arguably our greatest superpower.
And this capability to reflect, to review those alternative narratives, is what generates the realm of choice. The self may be an illusion, but it is an illusion that allows for a staggering range of behavioral alternatives.
Exactly, and that brings us to our final provocative thought for you to chew on. The construction of the sense of self allows for introspection, which expands the realm of alternatives for what to do, enabling a necessary degree of free will and the capacity to actively reprogram the subconscious mind. What rigid self-narrative about your limitations, your past failures, or your fixed identity could you begin to question this week, knowing that your identity is not a fixed entity, but a dynamic pattern you have the power to reorganize?